At the beginning of the story, we are introduced to a carpenter from the village named Joe Braven. He is seen working in the middle of heavy snow. Joe is known as a very diligent person. After putting all the wood into the truck, his workmate named Weston will move the wood to the factory, which is quite far away. After work, Joe spent time with his family, especially with his daughter Charlotte, because his wife Stephanie always worked from afternoon to night. In addition, Joe also has to look after his sing-out father. Let's call him Mr. Linden. He started suffering from this disease since he had an accident a year ago. That's why his memory has started to fade. He often looks for objects that are not clear. Worse yet, he often disappeared, suddenly go unknown where, and made Joe very worried. And this time the father went to a bar and fussed with the gangsters. As a result, he was beaten by several people until he was battered. Of course, Joe did not just silent, and Joe immediately beat them up to save his father. Thanks to his brutality, the gangsters were battered and ran away because they were afraid of his fierce face. After that, the police came to ask for information from Joe, and fortunately he was not blamed and was considered defending Mr. Linden. But if it happens again, then he could be thrown into prison. Joe then excused himself to pick up his father at the hospital. Here, the doctor said that Mr. Linden's illness could get worse because he had hit on his head during a fight with the gangsters. Therefore, the doctor suggested that Joe move him to a nursing home. However, Joe was confident that his family could still take care of his father. He then took Mr. Linden home after his wounds were treated by the doctor. When night was late, Joe vented his sadness by splitting firewood. It wasn't long before Stephanie woke up because of the sound of Joe's axe. She tried to calm her husband down and suggested that Joe take his father on a vacation to the family cottage. At the same time, Weston was on his way to deliver wood to the mill. But for some reason, he suddenly stopped at a very suspicious place. He then meets a gangster and drug dealer named Hallett. Apparently, Weston has been working with Hallett to distribute drugs in the area. And this time, they will both deliver illegal powder, aka illegal stuff, to his boss, Hallett. But on the way, suddenly their car hit a fallen tree and froze. This caused the truck to almost roll over, and the cargo fell onto the road. Unable to continue, Weston decided to walk to Joe's cottage. Then he hid the illegal powder before the police arrived. And after that, they rested at a nearby inn while waiting for help from Hallett's gang. Hallett then contacted his boss named Casson. He was the most ruthless mafia in the region and had a sizable drug business. Here, Hallett said that the illegal powder had been secured and only needed to be picked up the next day. After hanging up the phone, Casson punished his men who were incompetent in their work by beating them brutally and blindly. The next day, Joe invites Mr. Linden to take a vacation at the lodge, as well as inviting him to hunt. Investigated, Mr. Linden is a former great hunter and an expert in shooting from a long distance or sniper. He also passed on his knowledge to Joe, even though the man with the fierce face preferred to be a carpenter. Long story short, the two of them arrived at the hut. Before hunting, they decided to clean up the cottage, which had not been occupied for a long time. Afterward, Joe brought up the incident last night and the doctor's suggestion to move his father to a nursing home. Hearing that, Mr. Linden immediately became angry. He would never want to be treated in a group home because he felt fine. On the other hand, Casson and his men came to see Hallett and Weston. They all then go to Joe's cottage. However, they stop in front of the portal because Weston sees car tracks there, and he was sure that Joe was at the cottage. Hearing this, Casson immediately ordered his men to take weapons and planned to forcibly enter. He thought that Joe was just an ordinary carpenter who could be defeated very easily. As Joe's friend, Weston certainly didn't agree with Casson, but he couldn't do anything about it. That's because the gangsters would surely kill him if he dared to obstruct them. While they were staking out the lodge, Joe was in the warehouse. He was surprised when he saw a bag containing illegal powder. In addition, his father also saw footprints around the cottage. Plus, Charlotte suddenly appeared in front of them, which turned out to be this little girl deliberately hiding in the trunk of the car so she could join the hunt with her father and grandfather. But because something was wrong, Joe invited them to go home. And when they arrived near the portal, Casson ordered his men to finish off Joe and his family. But fortunately, Joe immediately realized this and chose to return to the log cabin. Joe and Mr. Linden then closed the hut tightly while preparing weapons to fight the gangsters. Meanwhile, Casson and the others began to surround the cottage from outside. Mr. Linden immediately went upstairs and alerted with his rifle. Meanwhile, Joe told Charlotte to hide in a safe room. Joe also tried to contact the police and his friends via the radio channel. That's because in that place, there is absolutely no cell phone signal. But unfortunately, the radio is not working properly. Joe then went upstairs to see the situation outside using his father's rifle, and he was very surprised when he saw the figure of Weston, who was his own co-worker. Joe finally decided to negotiate with Casson and the others. He brought some illegal powder to them, and the rest would be delivered after Casson and the gangsters left. Joe only wanted to save his father and daughter, but Casson did not agree with his offer. Casson promised to leave if Joe would hand over all the illegal powder in the hut. As they were bargaining, Weston suddenly interrupted their conversation. An angry Casson finished him off on the spot. Seeing that, Joe finally wanted to hand over the rest of the illegal powder. He said this so that Casson would not kill him. But after going inside, Joe and Mr. Linden planned an attack. With the attack, the plan was that Joe would kill them below, and his father would shoot the sniper brought by Casson. That way, Joe could be brutalized without anyone spying on him. From a distance, without lingering any longer, he immediately made an arrow from bamboo and put a doll into a drug bag that would be used to outwit Casson's men. Then when the gangster came to get the bag, suddenly the arrow shot right into Casson's man head. When Casson and the others began to get confused, Joe used it to go on an ATV. He then drove Charlotte up near the hill so that his daughter could contact her mother and the police. Joe then distracted Casson so that Charlotte had time to hide. But unfortunately, Casson already knew that he was being tricked by him. As a result, Casson ran up the hill and shot Joe until he rolled over. Casson then ordered one of his men to take the drug bag and finish off Joe. However, Joe suddenly just disappeared. Not only that, the bag he was carrying was not Casson's illegal powder. When Casson's men were down the guard, suddenly Joe appeared from behind and immediately beat him very cruelly. Joe then tied the gangster to the wheel of the ATV, then dragged him until he fell to a rock and died horribly. On the other hand, Charlotte was finally able to contact her mother and said that there were gangsters in the cottage. Stephanie, who was worried, immediately called her friend who was a policeman. Without wasting time, the policeman invited his colleague to check the situation at Joe's cottage. Meanwhile, Casson and Joe are still playing hide and seek, where the gangster is very difficult to find. How come Joe had the ability to hide? Thanks to the hunting knowledge taught directly by his father, Joe is now on the cliff to destroy Casson's car, so that the gangster cannot pursue him. At the same time, Casson tells Hallett to finish off Mr. Linden, who is alone in the cottage. Here Hallett underestimates the old man who he thinks will die easily. Hallett then entered the hut while raising his gun, but suddenly Mr. Linden shot at him, and there was even a fight. Mr. Linden managed to subdue Hallett by stabbing him in the leg. After brutally killing Hallett, Mr. Linden returned upstairs to stake out the gangsters. Meanwhile, Joe was in the middle of the forest and planned to trap Casson's other men. This time he deliberately dropped his knife on the ground to provoke the enemy. Joe then climbed up the tree, then lunged at the gangster from above. Joe immediately beat him mercilessly. But unfortunately, Joe didn't have time to kill him because Casson shot him from afar. Joe immediately ran towards the hut while avoiding attacks from the gangsters. Casson then attacked the lodge until finally Mr. Linden was shot in the place, and that made his memory even more chaotic. Worried, Joe asked his father to hide in the warehouse until he slaughtered Casson and his henchmen. At the same time, Stephanie had arrived near the hill with a bow and arrow. Just like her husband, Stephanie was also an archery expert. On the other hand, Charlotte, who was running towards her mother, was caught by Casson's men. Luckily, Stephanie managed to shoot the gangster very precisely. She then beat him up and stabbed him with a dagger until the gangster did not move. On the other hand, Casson and the others surrounded the lodge again and want to break in to finish off Joe and his father. But before that happens, Joe strangles one of the gangsters with a hot iron, which makes his neck almost cut off. In addition, he also burned every gangster who entered the lodge. Elsewhere, the police finally arrived in the scolded area. Charlotte, who saw him, immediately showed him the way to the cottage before Casson and the others caught his father and grandfather. Not long after, Casson managed to find Mr. Linden. Meanwhile, Joe is still busy finishing off the gangsters one by one. This time, Joe killed the gangster with an axe by throw that hit him right in the brain. But at the same time, Casson caught Mr. Linden and threatened to kill him if Joe did not hand over his illegal powder. But when Joe went to take it, Casson suddenly stabs Mr. Linden in the stomach until he dies. As Joe was mourning his father's death, one of Casson's surviving men wanted to shoot him. But luckily Stephanie immediately shot him from a distance. Seeing that, Joe immediately ran and finished off the gangster with his axe. Inside the hut, Casson took all the remaining illegal powder, then shot one of the policemen who had arrived there. Joe did not remain silent. He immediately chased him wherever he went. On the other hand, one of the policemen called for an ambulance and reinforcements from headquarters as the situation was getting out of hand. Moments later, the police arrived very quickly. At the same time, Joe was still chasing Casson in the forest. Then cleverly, he took a shortcut to get ahead of the gangster. After that, Joe tricked him with a rope, and while Casson was in shock, he grabbed his illegal powder and led Casson towards the cliff. Once there, Joe set up a bear trap and covered it with snow. Casson, who had just arrived, challenged Joe to a one-on-one duel, and the tussle was very tense. But unfortunately, Joe failed to push Casson into the trap he had made, until finally he decided to step on the trap while pushing Casson to the edge of the cliff. As a result, Casson died after hitting a coral reef. At the end of the film, Joe managed to climb back up the cliff and meet his family again, despite having to lose Mr. Linden. With Joe surviving all the events he experienced, then the movie ended.